Picture this. Your beloved wealthy aunt writes her will and she formally promises you her prized, vintage, cherry red convertible. You've known about it for years. But then, tragically, right before she passes away, she decides to sell the car. So when it's finally time to read the will, what exactly happens to your inheritance? Do you get the cash equivalent of that car, or do you get absolutely nothing? It's a fascinating question, and honestly, it's one that actually trips up thousands of families every single year.
Hi everyone, welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled you're here with us today because we are going straight to the source material, decoding inheritance, and exploring the three primary types of legacies. We're going to cut right through all that dense legal jargon surrounding wills and estates, breaking it down using some incredibly clear legal notes. By the end of our time together, you'll know exactly how the law categorizes an inheritance and why the specific wording in a will can literally mean the difference between a massive windfall and walking away entirely empty-handed.
All right, here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the anatomy of an inheritance, followed by the three types of legacies. Then, we'll introduce two massive threats, ademption and abatement. After that, we'll look at some real courtroom inheritance drama, and finally, we'll cover the legal shields that can protect you from losing everything. Let's get started.
Kicking things off with Section 1, Anatomy of an Inheritance. Because when someone passes away, their estate isn't just a giant pile of money that magically gets split up. It is heavily categorized.
Looking at the source notes, there's this fascinating handwritten legal flowchart that illustrates exactly how the legal system organizes that chaos. Notice how the very first question the law asks is specific property identified? If the answer is yes, we travel down one path to see if the item still exists. If it's a no, we travel down a completely different path to see if it's paid out of a specific fund or just the general estate. That initial categorization decides the ultimate fate of the whole inheritance.
Which brings us right to Section 2, the three types of legacies. Based on that flowchart, estate law essentially sorts all gifts into three distinct buckets. Let's meet them.
Bucket number 1 is the specific legacy. Our notes define this perfectly. It is identifiable property that is isolated and exact. It's a unique, physical thing that you can point a finger at. There's just no substituting it. To make that concrete, here are some examples straight from the source. A will might say, I leave the gold chain gifted by X to my nephew, or I leave my specific shares in Bank X to my daughter. The crucial point here is that a specific legacy is tied to a distinct item. It isn't just a gold chain. It is that exact gold chain.
Now flip that completely for bucket number 2, the general legacy. Here, there are absolutely no distinct items involved. It is simply a designated monetary value or quantity handed out from the general pool of the estate's assets.
For example, a will might just say, Rs 10,000 to Mr. X. The person writing the will isn't saying which 10,000 rupees to use. They aren't pointing to a specific shoebox full of cash tucked under a bed. They're just directing the executor to pull that value out of whatever general funds are left over after the debts are paid.
And that brings us to our third bucket, which is kind of the best of both worlds, the demonstrative legacy. Think of this as a brilliant hybrid. It's a bequest of a certain sum, but it's directed to be paid out of a very specific fund.
Here's a perfect example from the notes. 50,000 Rs from an SBI account. See how it blends the two concepts? It has the monetary value of a general legacy, 50,000 rupees, but it's tied to an isolated source, like a specific legacy, the SBI account. As we'll see in a second, this hybrid status actually makes it incredibly resilient. Now that we know our three legacies, it's time to introduce the first major villain in our inheritance story. Section 3, the threat of ademption. Ademption is a brutal, unforgiving legal rule. It basically states that if a specific item promised in a will ceases to exist or isn't owned by the deceased when they die, the legatee gets absolutely nothing. Remember that specific legacy, that gold chain? If the testator lost that chain before dying, the inheritance is addeemed. You don't get the cash equivalent. You just get zero.
But ademption isn't the only threat lurking in the legal shadows. Let's look at Section 4, the risk of abatement.
While ademption destroys specific items, abatement attacks the general money pool. Abatement happens when the estate simply runs out of money to pay its debts. If the estate's liabilities outbalance its assets, the law requires a proportionate reduction of legacies. Basically, everyone takes a financial haircut so the creditors can get paid. Let's put these side by side using this summary table from the notes. If you have a specific legacy, you are mostly immune to the estate running out of cash, abatement, but your risk of the item vanishing, ademption, is very high.
General legacy? You're immune to redemption since cash is cash, but your risk of losing it to estate debts is high. But look at the demonstrative legacy. It is the ultimate survivor. It's immune to redemption, and if the specific fund fails, it simply transforms into a general legacy, giving you a secondary safety net. Pretty clever, right?
Let's step out of theory and into the courtroom. Section 5, Real Courtroom Inheritance Drama. Just how strict are these rules really?
Let's look at the wild case of Durant versus Friend. The testator wrote in his will that he was bequeathing a specific, valuable article currently out on a sea voyage. The intent was crystal clear. But the harsh reality? The ship sank. The article perished at sea. The court ruled that because it was a specific legacy and the item no longer existed, it stood redeemed. And get this, even though there was insurance money paid out for the sunken ship, the court said nope, the insurance money cannot substitute the specific item. The inheritor got nothing.
Or take Ashburner versus Maguire. The will promised a specific capital stock of 1,000 in an India company. However, the testator voluntarily sold that exact stock before his death. Because the property was voluntarily withdrawn by the testator's own action, the specific legacy was redeemed. By cashing out his own stock, he accidentally wiped out his heir's inheritance. Okay, before you start panicking about your own family's estate planning, let's move to Section 6, Shields Against Losing Everything. The law can be harsh, but it actually shows mercy in a few very specific, fascinating scenarios. The source notes detail some amazing shields against redemption. First up, temporary removal. If a specific legacy is, say, a set of furniture in a house, and it gets relocated just to save it from a fire without the owner knowing, the legacy survives. The location was just descriptive. Second, change by law. If a 5.5% government loan is involuntarily converted to 5% stock by the state, the legacy survives because the testator didn't choose to do it. Third, replace stock. If specific stock is sold but then identically repurchased before death, it's not redeemed. And fourth, if a third-party fund is received and kept in a totally separate account, it's safe. But word of warning, if it gets mixed into general funds, it is redeemed instantly. Looking at the final handwritten case law notes, there's a real running theme here, and that is intent. What the courts are desperately trying to figure out is what the deceased actually wanted. If the change was an accident, an emergency, or forced by the government, the law really tries to protect the inheritance.
This is perfectly contrasted in two final cases about executors. In Lewis versus Matthews, an executor living abroad sent a power of attorney to help administer the estate, but sadly died before officially proving the will. The court ruled his actions showed clear intention to act, so his family got his legacy. Now, compare that to Bhwani versus Tapashari. A legatee was directed to perform a specific Hindu mourning ceremony, a shrud, to receive their legacy. The person merely showed up to the cremation and skipped the required ceremony itself. The court's ruling? No intent shown. The legacy was completely denied. Actions and provable intent literally make or break these claims.
So there you have it. We've explored the anatomy of inheritance, the strict definitions of specific, general, and demonstrative legacies, and the very real courtroom drama of redemption and abatement. These rigid historical laws are still making or breaking inheritances today, depending entirely on the specific words written on a page. Which leaves me with one final question for you to ponder. Based on the rules we just learned, how well are your own assets, or the assets you've been promised, actually protected? Think about it. Keep learning, keep organizing, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.